Welcome to another episode of the Age Diversity Network podcast. Today I'm delighted to say that we are joined by two guests, I should say distinguished guests, and are both university lecturers. Today we will be discussing all things age diversity, how this affects us in the workplace, how age is perceived, and intergenerational working. Our first guest is Dr. Hannah Swift, who is a senior lecturer in social and organisational psychology at the School of Psychology, University of Kent in the UK. She obtained her PhD in social psychology from the same university in 2012 and was supported by a grant from the Economic and Social Research Council and Age UK. Her research focuses on ageism, attitudes to age and their consequences, and has been supported by over $500,000 in grants from UK research councils, UK government and non-government organisations. She has also co-authored reports on age stereotypes, prejudice and discrimination for the UK Government Office for Science, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the Centre for Ageing Better, Department for Work and Pensions and the British Medical Association. Her research has also been published widely in academic journals. Our second guest today is Ben Steedon. Ben is a lecturer in occupational psychology at the University of the West of England in Bristol, teaching on the MSc in occupational psychology and undergraduate psychology programmes. Before this, Ben was a PhD researcher at the Centre for the Study of Group Processes at the University of Kent, where he had previously completed an MSc in Social and Applied Psychology. His research aims to highlight ageism in the workplace, exploring its impact on perceived leadership potential and hiring attitudes. Ben previously worked as a business consultant in positive psychology and spent over 15 years working in learning and development in financial services. Hannah, Ben, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the podcast. I think for the viewers and the listeners, it would be great to understand more about exactly what it is you do. I know you're both very similar. You're both lecturers at university in age diversity. I'm sure there's more to it than that. But if I could start with you, Hannah, if you could just explain what you actually do, and then once you've done that, Ben, maybe I could ask you the same, and then we can just go into a more deeper chat about ageism in the workplace. So Hannah, over to you.
Sure. So I'm Hannah Swift. I'm a senior lecturer in social and organisational psychology at the School of Psychology at the University of Kent. I'm also Programme Director of the Organisational and Business Psychology Masters Programme. And within that, what we try and do is teach our students how to use psychology, particularly social psychology, organisational business psychology, to solve real organisational and business problems. So my own research, I've been researching ageism. I finished my PhD, which was a collaborative PhD with Age UK on ageism. I finished that in 2012. And what I was looking at is not only sort of experiences of ageism that people have, the types of stereotypes and typical kind of representations that we have of older as well as younger people, but also how we feel about the aging process. And I look at this in a number of different areas. And one of those areas is the workplace, which is obviously why we're talking to you today on this podcast. But I also look at it in other areas. So in health and social care, for instance, or even in fashion and in what we wear, how notions of what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, how those are kind of created and the kind of consequences of those. And I also look at experiences and expressions of ageism. So personal experiences of ageism, but also how ageism is expressed in terms of attitudes, beliefs that we have, or cultural representations of age across different countries, particularly across Europe. So looking at things about when people think old age begins, for instance. There are actually very diverse notions and ideas about when we actually think old age begins across the European region. So quite diverse in terms of research and also in terms of research methods. But obviously one of the areas that I apply this research is in the workplace, specifically around ageism towards older people, towards younger people, intergenerational connections in the workplace, and obviously age diversity in the workplace as well.
Fantastic. Sounds really interesting. I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation, all three of us. Ben, can I just ask you to sort of give the listeners a little bit about yourself too, if you would?
Yes, my name is Ben Stevens. I'm a lecturer in occupational psychology at the University of West of England, or UE. So I teach on the master's programme there and on some undergraduate programmes as well. So on the master's programme, we're doing a similar thing. We're training people so that they can understand the psychology research that's out there and use that to make evidence-based decisions to help workplaces function really well, both for organisations and for people in it as well. And my research has been around age and in a recruitment context, and specifically looking at leadership potential. So who do we view as having leadership potential? Is that affected by their age? And my research suggests that it does, that it is. And how does that affect our assessments of their future performance and their hireability? Okay, so it's looking at kind of age, perceived leadership potential, recruitment assessments and hireability.
Okay, excellent. So I think between the three of us, we're definitely going to be talking about a lot. One of the things that I picked up there, Hannah, that you said earlier was, I think ageism in the workplace, clearly from a perspective of the Age Diversity Network, we do focus on the older workers, but you're absolutely right. Age diversity can also affect much younger people too, for different reasons. And I think the interesting thing that I picked up also on what you said was how ageism and when you get older is perceived at different stages in life throughout Europe. That's something that maybe not many people, and certainly not me, would have got to grips with per se. So is it that different across Europe, would you say?
Well, yeah, we were lucky enough. I think one of the key things with ageism research is that it's still very new. We've been doing a lot of research in social psychology and other disciplines looking at gender and race inequalities. But with age, it's only really just sort of gathering speed and sort of trying to catch up, and we're trying to apply some of those frameworks that we know that explain those other inequalities now to age. So the first survey that actually looked at age discrimination in the UK was done in 2004 with Age Concern, now Age UK. And one of the very first things that we tried to do in that survey, that was with my PhD supervisor, Professor Dominic Abrams, is actually try and benchmark and understand where people actually think youth ends and old age begins. So that we know that we apply these stereotypes to a group of others, older people, but we don't really have an idea of what people's understanding or society's understanding was of who these older people are. And I think this is something that we're still trying to understand now. When we say older people, who are we talking about? There's a famous quote, old age is always, 15 years older than I am. So we did that very first survey, 2004. We did another one with Age UK in 2006. And then we were very lucky to have a module in the European Social Survey, which then asked the same questions, but across the European region. And it's in that survey that we were able to say, actually, there are these big differences, not only individual differences. So we found that, there are participant age differences. So younger participants who answered the survey tend to think old age starts much earlier, so in around 50s. And as you get older, we did see that trend of, as people got older, they thought that old age started much later. But also across Europe, there were these country level differences. So in the UK, we tend to equate old age starting at around 60, which is probably geared in line with when we traditionally think people retire. So there's those kind of the merging of those two constructs. And in other countries, it was much earlier. And in some countries, it was much later. So for instance, one of the key countries that always comes to my mind is Greece. Tend to think that old age starts much later. So if you want to try and stay young, we always joke when we show people the data that you really need to go and be living in Greece, because they think that youth ends much later, around, I think it was around 50, and then old age starts much later after that. So there's obviously, it just speaks to the fact that age is a very socially constructed idea, and also the imagery that then goes along with that around what do we actually mean by older. The stereotypes and representations that we have of old age is also to some extent socially constructed.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess if we all sort of look back to maybe when we were in our late teens, starting off maybe our working lives or what have you, anyone in their 30s, mid 30s, approaching 50 potentially was old. When you reached your 30s, anyone in their sort of 50s were old. And it is a perception based, I think, on the here and now with a lot of people of how old they are and what they perceive. I remember, many years ago, unfortunately, but I was in my 30s and some kids were playing in the park one day, and they kicked the ball and it came over towards me, and I just got this sort of shouting, "Hey, old fella!" And I'm thinking, excuse me, I've just turned 30, and it really is a strange thing that people sort of understand. And I think also it sort of goes through the whole of life, doesn't it? It's sort of like, if you look at things like, what am I going to do when I retire? Not many people think about that when they're younger. How am I going to be financially secure when I retire? Well, that's too far away. I'm not really thinking about that. I think perceptions are changing in terms of people planning, maybe for future, your future self, if you like, when you are older. But it always seems to be that far away. And I think that's the issue. One of the other things that I do find, it depends on, and people talk about unconscious bias, and that's not really what we're going to get into, but there is obviously a lot of unconscious bias out there too. But I think with people in the older brackets, when I say the older brackets, I'm talking about the older working brackets, sort of 50s and onwards, if you like. Some of them do find it very, very difficult to be given the opportunity, or think they're not being given the opportunity. Obviously, two distinct differences, whether there's really ages in there and whether there's not. And I'm sure some maybe do make decisions in the hiring process without realizing what they're doing, and maybe there are some who do know what they're doing. But I think in terms of the hiring process and the older workers in the workplace, Ben, what would your thoughts be on that? I mean, do you think it's a major problem, or do you think it's something people just don't understand?
I think it's a problem. I don't think we necessarily know how much of a problem it is yet. I think we need to do a lot more work in it. I think, going back to what you were saying just before, I think there is an element of self-stereotyping with ageism as well, so that as we get older, we tend to kind of internalize these expectations, these stereotypes about older people, and so we tend to see ourselves as perhaps more vulnerable, less competent, struggling more with technology, and therefore that might stop us applying for jobs in the first place if we see that those skills are kind of a key part of doing those jobs. And so again, in terms of understanding how much of a problem it is, it can be quite difficult to tell, because how do you know who didn't apply for a job? And therefore, how can you spot some of those processes going on? So I think it is an issue. I think we can do more around looking at job descriptions perhaps, and making sure that the language we use is more inclusive and is less triggering of kind of age stereotypes. So I think there is a lot we can do there, but it's difficult. Sometimes what we're struggling to do with research is to take these intangible things and make them tangible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've seen in that type of perspective is that you can get an organization that will say, this is our ethos, this is what we're about, this is what we believe in, we're very diverse, and that can either be driven by one of two drivers. One may be that we have a diversity and inclusion department. We have our duty as an organisation and an employer to show that's the way we are, and that's fine. But if you're just doing it to do that and tick a box to say that's what we're doing, that's one thing. It actually doesn't achieve much. The other side is where I've spoken to a number of people in diversity and inclusion and trying to obviously address not just ageism in the workplace, but other isms too, where they really do believe that there is benefit. Quite frankly, at the end of the day, we talk about diversity and inclusion. I've always worked on the basis that even if you got rid of the word diversity and just use the word inclusion, that's good enough, because quite frankly, it doesn't matter what race you are, how old you are, whatever the isms are out there, it's all about an inclusive environment. I think the other thing is with picking up on what you just said there, Ben, about the older worker maybe not feeling possibly up to date with technology, or they have the current skills. I think one of the other things is that often in their head, like anyone, we all feel younger than we really are, probably. You know, I'd love to go out and run around the park, you know, run 5-10 miles. I can't. It'd be nice to do that. I used to be able to do that, but your mind is different than your actual body is capable of doing. But I think in terms of the mind, it is still there. And I think the wisdom, knowledge, experience maybe that an older worker can bring can reap huge benefits for an organisation. And I think coming back to you, Hannah, what you said earlier about intergenerational workforces, that I think can work really, really well if people understand it and organisations understand how different generations can work together and what they can get from each other. It's not just about an older worker coming in and saying, I know best. It's about an older worker maybe coming in and saying, well, I've been there before. I've been in that situation. This is how I handled it. Maybe a younger worker may not have come across it before. And also with the younger person, teaching the older worker things that they don't know. And I think working together like that is fantastic. So is that something, Hannah, that you sort of looked at in terms of the intergenerational piece?
Well, I think the intergenerational workplaces are, you know, the workplace is a great place for, you know, potentially for generations to work together on topics, on projects, and, you know, for lots of ideas to be had from, you know, the diversity of having mixed aged workforce teams. But there's a tendency, I think, for maybe organisations to say, well, we have age diversity, but not really to actually look and see whether those teams do actually have representation from different ages. So there's one thing to say, well, we have, you know, people aged, you know, across the working lifespan in our organisation, and we have lots of people, but when you actually look on the ground and ask yourselves, are they actually working together? That is a different question. Are they actually interacting, communicating with each other, working on projects together? And then there's also the issue that even though you might have people working together on, you know, different ages, how much do people actually value the contribution of the older workers? So we know from the research that we do on age stereotypes is that, you know, we tend to associate and we tend to value young and associate younger workers with having potential, which is what Ben works on, and creativity, entrepreneurship, innovation, being quick and, you know, coming up with ideas, being creative around those ideas. But we tend to stereotype older workers as somehow losing that creativity or not having that creativity. So if they're, depending on what they're working on, you could have a mixed, diverse team, but is that older worker really being listened to and heard, and are their ideas being valued? Which is another question. And that's where also, you know, from our research on age stereotypes, we tend to find that, and within organisations, when you listen to people talk about their experiences of ageism, it's not necessarily that they're not being included, but it's about the value of being included. So yes, I'm being included in diverse teams and workforces, but are my ideas being valued and taken forward? And that's something else. And I think with this with this research with ageism, and that's why I think we're very much at the beginning of really just unpacking exactly what the problems are and what the dynamics are. As I alluded to earlier, with understanding about age categorizations, when we think, oh, an age begins, if we see age as very relative, then in those mixed group teams, you know, an older worker, if you're working with a group of 20-year-olds, then an older worker could be somebody, you know, in their 40s. And you know, we tend to traditionally think that ageism is something experienced by 50 plus or 60 plus or 70 plus people, but actually, you know, it's very slippery in the workplace to actually get a grip and to get a handle on the dynamics that are influencing ageism and the stereotypes, and when they're being attributed and applied to people and when they're not.
Yeah, and I think that's very true, because again, people have this perception that ageism in the workforce probably starts when you're in your 60s, nearing what's perceived to be the retirement age coming up soon. But actually it's not. I've spoken to many people who are in their 40s that believe they're suffering from that too. And you know, it's very difficult, because I don't like it to become a finger pointing exercise. What I like to do is sort of understand why and what can be done to change people's understanding, to educate people and train people in how they can actually deal with these types of situations, as against saying someone's doing something wrong. Because often if you do have a young dynamic, I don't know, let's say advertising or social media company that's a young startup with 20 plus people working in there, no one else, and a 40-50-year-old comes along, are they perceived as not being up to date? They're not savvy, they're not young and hip, they can't get to grips with this, or not? Because to me, people still want to learn, and I'm not saying that they want to become social media experts or anything like that, but again, there's all the softer skills around what an older worker can bring to the table. Excuse me. That may well be, well, certainly transferable skills, which is always difficult to define, but you know, once you start speaking to people, you understand what skills they've got that they can actually bring that would make a big difference. So I think it is a perception thing too, and it's hard, because I think the younger people, when they're in that situation, it's difficult for them too, because maybe they can't quite see the benefits of an older, wiser, more knowledgeable, skillful person coming in to help them with things that they may need help with, but because they're young and brash and go-getters, they feel that they don't need that input. Who knows? You know, there's many different reasons, I think. But Ben, question for you. So with you've also looked at the younger end of the scale in the workforce, or the younger versions, I suppose, not older workers in the workforce, but in ageism. It does exist as well, and I've spoken to a few people about that in the past. So without me trying to sort of focus on the older workers, which I will again soon, because that's what I do, but I'm still interested in your input in the sense of how it affects the younger workforce. Either is it affecting them personally, or is it something that you're trying to get them to understand about ageism in the workplace?
Well, I think potentially, but most of my research has been around ageism faced by older people in the workplace. But ageism is a barrier to taking part, and to be able to. Ageism can stop you taking part in particular jobs. It can stop you being considered for particular jobs. It can stop you from being considered for different learning and training opportunities. And that's regardless of what your age group is. It just means that someone is making a decision about you based on the age group that you're a part of, rather than based on the skills and experience you bring as an individual. So any ageist view can present a barrier to your career, to what you can do at work, to your ability to bring your best self to work. And that's not restricted to one particular age group, that's any age group.
Yeah, sure. Okay, no, that's fine. I think one of the things I've also seen quite a bit of in the past, and probably will continue to, is that when you've got the older workers who are looking for work, they they won't necessarily be looking to climb up the corporate ladder. They may well think, well, I've been there, I've done that, and I'm just happy to use the skills and knowledge I've got now, and I just want to contribute somehow. You've got ones that are already working, that want to continue or maybe move in a slightly different direction. You've got others that find it extremely difficult to get back into work, and if they've been out of work for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, and it can go on and on and on, which can affect someone who's been out of work for either they have lost their job, or unfortunately with the pandemic, they may have been furloughed, they're made redundant. You may have had a lady who's taken time off to bring up a family and decides to get back into work, might be in their 40s, 50s, whatever, and thinking, I want to go back out to work. There's all sorts of things that can prevent them actually getting the roles that they're looking for, or even getting an interview. I mean, getting an interview can be quite tough for a lot of people. And I think the thing for me is, in terms of what you guys are doing, is there sort of anything that you think, is it a lack of education, a lack of understanding? What would you say is the issue in terms of, and I'm not asking you to fix the world here and now, but it's just interesting to hear what you think about what the actual issues are, why you think we're there, and the older workers suffer this. And any one of you can start.
I think I'll give it a first go if that's okay. So I think it's all these representations are there from the minute we're born. So we're expressed, this is what an older person is like, this is what a younger person is like. So these kind of stereotypes that Hannah was talking about before, they're in the media, they're in our school life, our family life, they're in adverts, they're in everything we're exposed to as we're brought up. So it's about looking, I suppose it's not so much looking at it in one domain of saying this is kind of restricted to the workplace, because it's not. It's about recognizing that these stereotypes and the limitations that come out of those stereotypes are everywhere. And all of us are exposed to them most days, if not every day. And so I think in terms of kind of where do we focus, and where the problem is, it's kind of everywhere, which I don't want to make sound really scary. I think there's still things we can do about it, but that's kind of my first response anyway. I don't know what you think, Hannah.
Well, I think there's a couple of things that we're looking at in our research. So we've done some research in the past, you know, asking participants and looking particularly at words used in job adverts and that we know are associated with younger workers or with older workers. And then if you expose people and you ask people, well, would you prefer this CV and this person who's good at doing these things, which happen to be associated with younger people, versus this CV, which, you know, the words the things that they're good at are more representative of what we think older people are good at, then our research shows that an overwhelming majority of our participants will prefer and would rather hire the person with the younger sounding CV. So there is this sort of value that we place on youth, perceived youth, and in Ben's research, some of that value is because that we perceive that person to have a lot of potential in the workplace. So because they're younger, you know, they're going to have longer careers and pathways and etc. So one of the things that we're looking at is looking at those words and whether actually the new research that we're conducting at the moment is actually looking at whether the first point of discrimination is actually that older workers are excluding themselves from jobs and from positions that they see because they perceive themselves not to fit. They don't see themselves mirrored in those words that are used because they're very much words that we associate with younger people. And this actually brings me on to a point, I think one of the interesting things about ageism research that hasn't really been explored very much, and that Ben is really interested in exploring further, is this idea of perceived fit. Right, so a lot of the ageism comes about because we don't perceive people to fit in those particular roles in the same way within, you know, using the same frameworks that gender research on gender has looked at in terms of women in male-dominated workplaces. We have these norms that are constructed around particular organisations and industries and companies that are age-based. And then there's this barrier that we face in trying to get people into those workplaces. Younger people feel this differently, but in a similar way, based on hierarchies of jobs. You know, you're too young to be managing. You know, people are more comfortable with having a worker or a boss that's age 70 than they are having and being managed by somebody who's younger, because we have this norm around, you know, you enter the workplace and then you move up the career ladder, and you get into those managerial positions once you've had experience. So younger people feel this lack of fit, and age discrimination perhaps in this way slightly differently. You know, they're highly competent, they're energetic, dynamic, innovative, creative individuals. So they benefit from those kind of stereotypes, but they don't benefit from that kind of, well, we need somebody who's also reliable and experienced. And also, you know, you are not going to be able to fit and manage a group of individuals who are older than you. Right, the age imbalance sort of creates this idea, or this shows an imbalance.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think one of the things that I have seen people talk about in the past is if you have people in the younger generation that have this, I wouldn't say fear, but hesitance to actually have someone who's working for them who's 20 years older than them, for instance. You know, they could be looking at thinking, oh, that's my dad, that's my mum, or what have you, and whether they feel comfortable with that or not, I don't know. Interesting point. But Ben, so flipping over to you and what Hannah just said, so do you think sometimes that the older worker maybe needs to sort themselves out first? They might be their own worst enemy in a way, in terms of how they approach things?
Well, I don't know. I'd be sort of worried about saying it's the older person's responsibility to kind of fix it, I suppose. I think going back to that issue of self-stereotyping, it's looking at kind of how we can stop ourselves kind of accepting limiting stereotypes as we age. So I think there is some focus there on how we can do that. But I think it's much more looking at an employer level to make sure that we've got a kind of fair, systematic, scientific assessment process, which is less open to age bias. And also going back to what we were saying before, where we're advertising jobs using language that doesn't kind of trigger bias as well. So I think there is, so I suppose there is some emphasis, as it's partly to do with self-stereotyping, it is partly trying to find ways of preventing that and limiting self-stereotyping. But I wouldn't want to put all the focus on older people to stop age bias, because I don't think that's the right target. But I think it's a social issue. It's something we can look at from a lot of different perspectives.
And still just raising at the stage where we're trying to raise awareness of the fact that it is a layer that people should be looking at in terms of hiring people. When you think about unconscious bias training, we touched upon it briefly, but the tendency is it's all around gender and it's all around race and ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Yeah. But people still not really learning that age is one of those protected characteristics as well.
Yeah, I think one of the might be an article I wrote a year or so ago touched on that, which is very difficult because certainly there are lots of different diverse problems out there. We know that. But I've always maintained that the other ones that you've just discussed, absolutely agree with you. And ageism, for whatever reason, seems to be at the bottom of the pile, is sort of like the poor cousin at the moment, and is just about beginning to raise its head above the surface. I did speak to a company 3 or 4 weeks ago who have recognised the fact that ageism in the workplace is something that they do need to focus a little bit more on in their diversity and inclusion program. They're as you rightly say, all of the other isms have been addressed for many, many years, and this is something that is out there. Yes, of course, it can't be fixed overnight. We know that. And part of what we're trying to do, and certainly what you're doing in an academic way, is to try and raise that awareness, is to try and educate people, get them to understand that this is out there, and come up with ways to get people to think of it differently and what benefits you can have. So for me, absolutely, that's why the Age Diversity Network exists, really, is to sort of try and raise that focus. I think the interesting thing for me is I've spoken to quite a few different academics from different backgrounds, and this is the first time that I've spoken to people that specifically do focus on ageism. And that's why I'm loving having you on the podcast. So it might not be easy to answer this question, but I'll start with you, Ben. What made you actually focus on that type of area as your background and moving forward?
I suppose, well, this is all about self, isn't it? For me, as I was getting older, I started to think about it more, and so it became more relevant to me, I suppose. It makes me sound very selfish, but that is part of the reason why I became more interested in it. And also then when I kind of looked into it, it's, people are tending to live for longer, people are having to work for longer, and so it seems to be, it's more of a social issue, but it doesn't get maybe as much attention as it should. And so it was a desire to kind of, that's what kind of generated that desire to do some research on it.
Yeah, excellent. And similar reasons for you, Hannah, or different?
Well, slightly different. So Ben had a career, I guess, beforehand in business consultancy, didn't you? So you had a lot more experience in the workplace and dealing with, I guess, different businesses and organisations and things like that. Whereas for me, I got interested in ageism because, I was doing a lot of social psychology at university, and partly the opportunity came up to do the PhD with Age UK, which was to very much kind of actually look at ageism in more detail, because this was one of the first sort of PhD studentships that they had, moving into that area. But personally, I'm really interested in just where we get our ideas around age from and how they impact on us. So, growing up, I was also, I had I talk about my grandmother sometimes. She was a healthy ager. She retired, became a yoga teacher, and my memories of her were of her in the living room looking after us whilst doing headstands. So my idea of what a grandmother looks like is perhaps slightly different. She was very active and doing lots of crazy, I guess you would call them crazy things, but actually for me they were very normal things. So what I can strive to be and my ideas around what's achievable in later life might be different to somebody who didn't have that kind of role model. And then working in a care home, when I was younger, one of my first jobs, cleaning in a care home, I was always struck by how people were surprised that they would get along with residents who were much older than them, and were surprised when they would be talking about, if they were funny, if they were making them laugh, if they made a joke. And it was very interesting to me, as a 16-year-old, thinking, why do we think that people in care homes aren't funny, or somehow we dehumanize them, is one of the terms that we look at in ageism research. Yeah. So we tend to think that they don't have the same capacity to have emotions, don't feel the same emotions. We think that they're not going to be interested in the same types of music because of their age. So I was kind of interested in just those things growing up. I always thought, well, obviously these are just people. They're going to be funny. They're going to be interested in music. They're going to be interested in hobbies. Just because they're in a care home now doesn't mean that they're not going to still be interested in those things.
No, exactly.
So that's one of the that's a couple of reasons why I've sort of always been a bit fascinated by the way in which we negatively stereotype or view getting older and how we feel about getting older. And my research has touched upon those things, obviously how they impact in the workplace, but also just how they impact our own sort of well-being and how we feel about our own aging process.
Mm-hmm. No, interesting. I think picking up on what you said about dehumanizing, one of the things that I've always thought of, which is so difficult to get people to understand, you can only probably do it as part of training really, is to humanize these type of situations. And what I mean by that is if you had I don't know, people that didn't think that they were ageist, but actually they are and they don't realize it, is if they were dealing with somebody who was 20, 30 years older than them in the workplace or interviewing them for a role, whatever the case may be, is if we were able to say to them, well, who's your favorite uncle? Who's your favorite auntie? You know, in your family, if that was them sitting in front of you, how would you respond? And I'm not saying favoritism or nepotism, give them the job because of that. What I'm saying is actually treating them more like a human as against somebody who's older, because they wouldn't do that with their own family. So if they could somehow sort of understand everyone is in the same boat these days, unfortunately. And you said earlier, Ben, people are working longer. The retirement age has extended. It's going to extend again. You know, maybe people are, forget the pandemic, but people are getting healthier and living longer. I don't know the stats on the living longer bit, but there are people that need to work for many reasons. And the two most prominent ones I can think of is they want to stay active. They feel they've still got something to offer and they want to be a part of something and give something back and keep working until they feel that they can't work anymore. There are others financially have to, and they're finding it very, very tough. And they feel that they're actually being not given the opportunities maybe that other people are, that they should be afforded. So it's quite interesting, and we can keep going back and saying, yes, it is early days. I think in terms of the ageism in the workplace is a very, very tough thing to sort of address, and it is all through education. And I think what you guys are doing in terms of focusing on what that really means, why is it, and putting papers together. And it's good that as part of your courses that other students, younger students, are being more engaged in this type of thing as well, because I don't know in academia, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that ageism in the workplace and that type of thing hasn't really come to the forefront in the academic world until reasonably recently. And if that's the case, then obviously there is still a long road ahead, but it's nice that it's actually starting to be taught now and for people to understand, because that's going to hopefully help the next generation to sort of get to grips with that.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so in terms of where you go from here, what do you hope? I think this is one of those podcasts that we did speak before we started the podcast off, and I think it's actually got to that point where there's so much that we need to talk about. So I think this is going to end up as part one, and we're going to have to come back another time and do a part two. But in the interests of time, I think what would you say, start with you, Hannah, is what do you hope to achieve out of what you're actually doing? Where do you think or hope this will lead to?
Well, I think part of what we're trying to do, and we're always sort of constantly trying to get funding for bits of research that we're doing exploring these issues. And so I think there's obviously the line of research that we need to continue doing to answer some of these questions. I think there is still some work to be done around and what you're doing, which is sort of connecting up organisations and businesses together to have these discussions about what are they doing, what are they not doing, what best practices are there, how can we learn from each other. And because I think, you know, whenever you're engaging in an issue that's around equality, there's always a bit of a fear to sort of stick your hand up and say, actually, we need to address this in our organisation. Because there's this kind of, you know, fear that you're actually sticking your head up and saying that there is a problem. So doing what you're doing, which is sort of through the network, connecting people up and having these conversations is really, really important. And then on the other side of it, Ben and I will be continuing to work in this area to try and provide organisations and businesses with tools and things that they need. So we're sort of open to having conversations with anybody who is thinking that they might want something and what that might look like in this area, and try and develop things that will be actually used in a collaborative way, rather than us sort of going, well, this is the research and this is what it tells us. Because
sure.
Anything that we do together has to be a collaborative sort of co-produced.
Exactly. Okay, and how about you, Ben?
I think firstly, just to echo what Hannah was saying there, it's about using the research to come up with tools that we can use. It's about interventions that organisations can use to reduce bias in the workplace, age bias in the workplace. I think it's also about identifying pathways to bias. So my work has been around leadership potential and seeing that as a potentially a bit of a fuzzy concept that can lead to more age bias. Hannah talked before about this idea of best fit and how that might do the same. So I think it's identifying pathways to bias and then identifying ways to overcome bias in the workplace, tools that we can use. And it is about connecting people, and definitely very much about connecting people doing the research and practitioners in workplaces as well, to kind of close that science practitioner gap a bit, so that we're getting insights from both perspectives and we're coming up with tools that are based on kind of solid research but are practical and implementable.
And of course, Ben and I also have lots of interesting kind of theories around what COVID might be doing and to the workplace, and how this might be, exacerbating any ageism or creating age bias as well towards younger and older. So I think that could be another potential episode or part 2.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think we would definitely will have to have a follow-up. I think also, so before the follow-up, if anyone's interested in the research you're doing or wants to make contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that, Hannah?
So via LinkedIn, Ben and I are both on LinkedIn. I've also got Twitter, but I'm not particularly great at social media, I have to say. I'm much better on LinkedIn, but at Twitter it's at Hannah Swift, or via email, which is at h.j.swift@kent.ac.uk.
Okay, fantastic. I will repeat those at the end of the podcast, but also for anyone watching, there'll be some gaps which will be down here. People that will be watching can see what I'm doing, but I'm pointing to the corners. So I'll be putting them up on there. And Ben, what's the best way for people to contact you?
LinkedIn as well. So I'm on LinkedIn, so feel free to contact me on there. And I work at University of West of England. So if you go onto the UWE website, you can find my details there, and email me on ben.steeden, which is STEEDEN, at uwe.ac.uk.
Fantastic. Well, I will make sure that they're up on the screen as well. In the meantime, it's been absolutely fantastic. Really, really appreciate all the time that you've spent with me today. It's a shame that these things can't go on for long, but I don't think people would be listening to them if they went on for hours. So definitely a part 2 coming up. And I thank you both very, very much for joining. And I look forward to us speaking again at some time in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you are affected by age diversity issues at work, or are experiencing problems seeking employment and believe that your age is a barrier, or if you are an inclusive employer who actively embraces the older worker and are interested in the services and help we can offer, then please contact us at www.agediversitynetwork.com or simply follow us on LinkedIn.